Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. We will be at MagicCon Chicago this upcoming February 21st through the 23rd. On Friday, we will be in the Learn to Play CEDH area in the Creator Central throughout the day. We will also be hosting a meet and greet from 12:30 to 2. Come say hi or bring us your deck for a quick ad hoc deck check. We will also be giving out swag while we're there, so come by and say hi. On Saturday, we will be in the Creator Central recording CEDH games for the channel. Come by with your best brews and get ready to throw down. Zeb will also be bringing his Commander Cube and will be firing it all day long. You can also find us around the convention throughout the weekend, just jamming games and playing with everyone. We hope to see you there. Let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Zeb piloting Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. This is an aristocrat style deck that seeks to use the graveyard and reanimation effects. It then creates a loop that drains the table and wins the game. Next, we have Ryan, piloting Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. This is a manual storm deck that seeks to use its commander to gain guard advantage through the use of pingers and its commander. It then closes out the game with a number of loops, including Agatha Soul Cauldron or Dualcaster Mage. After that, we have one of our patrons, Brandon, piloting Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. This deck seeks to ramp on mana through its commander to start activating Kinnan and put massive threats onto the battlefield. It also combos with cards like Basalt Monolith to generate infinite mana and win the game. Finally, we have Philip, piloting Roxanne, Starfall Savant. This is a food chain deck that leverages creature synergies to gain advantage. It then uses food chain to generate infinite mana and burn out the table with its commander. This video would not be possible without all the support of all of our sponsors, including viewers like you on Patreon. If you wanted to support this content, be sure to check out the links below. You can also support us for free by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a compliment down in the compliment section below. Without further ado, let's kick off this urgent urban upswinging upstart. Zeb held the Crow Yoga pose the longest and gets to start us off. But Ryan has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Deadly Rollick. Zeb draws a card for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts Mox Diamond. In response, Zeb cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. Mox Diamond resolves and Ryan discards a Phyrexian Tower. He cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Kessig Flamebreather. He casts Hope of Girapur. After an explosive turn 1, Ryan passes. Brandon draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Manamo, School at Water's Edge. He casts Sylvan Library. Brandon ends his turn. Philip draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Elvish Mystic. He passes. At the end of Philip's turn, Zeb casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Zeb. Zeb draws and plays a Plaza of Heroes. He casts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. He casts Mox Diamond. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Diamond resolves, Zeb doesn't discard a land, and Mox Diamond goes to the graveyard. He ships the turn. Ryan draws and casts Rite of Flame. Kessig Flamebreather triggers and each opponent loses 1. Then Ryan adds 2 red. He casts his commander, Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Resolves and Ryan moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Hope of Girapur and Brandon with Kessig Flamebreather. They both take it, triggers twice, gets 2 +1/+1 counters, and Ryan exiles a Sensei's Divining Top and a Lion's Eye Diamond. In his second main phase, Ryan casts Lion's Eye Diamond from exile. Kessig triggers, each opponent takes 1, triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Yawgmoth's Will. Next, Ryan cracks his LED, discards his hand, which only contains Prosper Tomebound, and adds 3 black. He casts Yawgmoth's Will from exile. Kessig triggers, each opponent loses 1, triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Mana Confluence. Then Yawgmoth's Will resolves. Ryan plays Mana Confluence from exile. He casts LED from his graveyard through Yawgmoth's Will. Kessig deals 1 to each opponent, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles the Orcish Bowmasters. He taps Mana Confluence to cast Rite of Flame from his graveyard. Kessig deals 1, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Bloodstained Mire. Then Ryan adds 2 red. Ryan cracks his LED and adds 3 black. He casts Prosper Tomebound from his graveyard. He casts Sensei's Divining Top from exile. Prosper and Kessig trigger, each opponent takes 1, Ob gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Felwar Stone. Ryan then creates a treasure and Sensei's Divining Top resolves. He moves to his end step, Prosper triggers, and he exiles a mana ball. Ryan passes to Brandon. During his draw step, Brandon draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both without even looking at what they are. In his main phase, he plays a Yavimaya Coast for turn. He taps it to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Simic Signet. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Jessica's Will. Kinnan resolves, and Brandon ships the turn to Philip. Philip draws and plays a command tower. He casts Priest of Titania. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Destiny Spinner. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Tybalt's Trickery. Philip passes the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it and pays a life. Triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Forbidden Orchard. Then Zeb fetches up a Swamp onto the battlefield. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Lotho as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He transmutes Shred Memory, discarding it, and fetching up an Animate Dead into his hand. He casts Unmarked Grave. He fetches up a Hoarding Broodlord into his graveyard. He casts Animate Dead, returning Hoarding Broodlord from his graveyard to the battlefield. Broodlord triggers, and Zeb fetches up a card into exile face down. He convokes his Broodlord to help cast Saw in Half from exile, targeting Broodlord. Broodlord dies, and Zeb creates 2 copies. Both trigger, and Zeb fetches up 2 more cards into exile face down. He convokes a Broodlord to cast Sacrifice from exile, sacrificing one of his Broodlords as an additional cost, adding 8 black. He convokes his other Broodlord to help cast Peer into the Abyss from exile, targeting himself. He draws half of the cards in his library and loses half of his life rounded up. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Vanishing Verse. He casts Mox Opal. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Corpse Knight. He casts Entomb, fetching up Leonin Relic Warder into his graveyard. He casts Sabine's Reclamation. He returns Animate Dead from his graveyard to the battlefield. Animate Dead enters, and Zeb returns Leonin Relic Warder to the battlefield. Relic Warder triggers, exiling Animate Dead. Animate Dead is exiled, triggers, and Zeb sacrifices it. Corpse Knight and Relic Warder trigger. Zeb returns Relic Warder to the battlefield. He presents a loop of exiling Animate Dead, sacrificing Relic Warder, returning Animate Dead, and returning Relic Warder to the battlefield. Each time he does this, he stacks Corpse Knight triggers before continuing the loop. He does this over and over until he has enough triggers to kill the table. He then lets them all resolve at once, kills the table, and Zeb wins the game. Before Game 2, Zeb has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Verdant Catacombs. Ryan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to cast a Sensei's Divining Top. He uses his floating mana to activate top, looking at the top 3 and rearranging. Ryan passes. Brandon draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Lotus Petal. He taps City of Brass and cracks Lotus to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He passes the turn. Philip draws, plays a City of Brass as well, and ships the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Plaza of Heroes. He casts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Zeb ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Unstable Amulet. It enters, and Ryan gets 2 energy. He uses his remaining floating to activate Sensei's Divining Top, looking at the top 3 and rearranging. Ryan passes to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. Brandon passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Philip taps his City of Brass to help cast Worldly Tutor, fetching up a Tinderwall onto the top of his library. Philip draws and taps his City of Brass to help cast Tinderwall. He passes. Zeb draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Lotho. Ryan takes it, and Zeb ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it and pays a life. In response, Zeb casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He flashes in an Opposition Agent. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Opposition Agent resolves, and then Zeb fetches up a Swamp from Ryan's library into exile. He activates his Unstable Amulet, paying 2 energy, and exiles a Razorkin Needlehead off of the top of his library. Unfortunately stifled, Ryan passes. Brandon draws, holds open mana, and passes. Philip draws, takes no actions, and also passes. Zeb draws and plays a Swamp from exile as his land for turn. He casts Dothy Voidwalker. In response, Ryan taps Ancient Tomb to flash in an Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, targeting Lotho. In response, Zeb casts Get Lost, targeting Bowmasters. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Bowmasters is destroyed, Ryan creates 2 useless map tokens, and then Lotho dies, and Ryan amasses Orcs 1, then Dothy Voidwalker resolves. Zeb attempts to move through phases, and in response, Ryan uses his floating mana to activate Sensei's Divining Top, rearranging the top 3. Zeb passes. Ryan draws and plays a Mount Doom. He taps it and Ancient Tomb to help cast his commander, Nixilis, Captain Kingpin. Ryan ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Manamo, School at Water's Edge as his land for turn. Brandon passes. Philip draws, plays a Command Tower, and ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays a Caves of Koilos for turn. He recasts his commander, Lotho. Zeb ships the turn. Ryan draws and taps Mount Doom to help cast Razorkin Needlehead from exile. Unstable Amulet triggers, and each opponent takes 1. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Twin Flame. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Lotho triggers, Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a command tower. He plays Command Tower from exile as his land for turn. He taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Twin Flame from exile, targeting Razorkin Needlehead. Unstable Amulet triggers, each opponent takes 1. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Grim Monolith. He activates Sensei's Divining Top, rearranging the top 3. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with his Razorkin and Zeb with Nixilis. They both take it, and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Brandon casts Resculpt, targeting opposition agent. Agent is exiled, Zeb creates an elemental, Resculpt goes to the Void Zone, Ryan sacrifices his Razorkin copy, and the turn moves to Brandon. Brandon draws, Razorkin triggers, and deals 1 to Brandon. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Mana Vault. In his main phase, Brandon plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn. He taps City of Brass to help cast Finale of Devastation where X equals 2. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Mana Confluence. Finale resolves, and Brandon fetches up a Thrasios, Triton Hero, onto the battlefield. Brandon passes. Philip draws and takes the damage from Razorkin Needlehead. Triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles Agatha's Soul Cauldron. In his main phase, Philip plays a Verdant Catacombs for turn. He taps the City of Brass for a green. Triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles an Underworld Breach. Philip sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts Treasonous Ogre. He pays 6 life, adding 2 red. He casts Twin Flame, targeting Treasonous Ogre. He holds priority and pays 9 life, adding 3 red. He flashes in a Dualcaster Mage. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Soul Ring. Dualcaster Mage resolves, targeting Twin Flame. In response, Zeb sacrifices Dothy Voidwalker, casting Resculpt from exile, targeting Dualcaster. Dualcaster is exiled, and Philip creates an elemental. Then the Dualcaster trigger resolves, creating a copy of Twin Flame, targeting his elemental. He creates a copy, then the original Twin Flame resolves, creating a copy of Treasonous Ogre. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with the elemental and Brandon with Treasonous Ogre. Dethrone triggers, I'll bet you all forgot Ogre had that ability, didn't ya? And Ogre gets a +1/+1 counter. Zeb blocks the elemental with his elemental, and Brandon takes 3. In his second main phase, Philip cracks Verdant Catacombs and pays a life. Triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Calling the Weak. Then Philip fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. Philip passes, sacrificing his Ogre copy. Zeb draws and takes a damage from Razorkin. Triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Sibian Spirit Guide. In his main phase, he plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Bolus's Citadel. It resolves, and Zeb looks at the top card of his library. He pays 2 life to cast Lively Dirge from the top of his library through Citadel, cracking 3 treasures to pay both spree costs. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Saw in Half. Then Lively Dirge resolves, and Zeb fetches up a Drannith Magistrate into his graveyard. He then returns Drannith Magistrate and Dothy Voidwalker from his graveyard to the battlefield. All through, Zeb passes. Ryan draws and plays a Mana Confluence from exile as his land for turn. And before you ask, yes, Ryan can do that through Drannith Magistrate. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Nixilis. Zeb takes it all and dies to commander damage. In his second main phase, Ryan casts Slaughter Pact, killing Kinnan. He taps Ancient Tomb to cast Soul Ring from exile. Unstable Amulet triggers, and each opponent takes 1. Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Final Fortune. He casts Mana Vault from exile. Amulet deals 1 to each opponent, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Rending Volley. He casts Underworld Breach from exile. Amulet deals 1 to each opponent, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Deflecting Swat. Next, Ryan casts Saw in Half from exile, targeting Razorkin Needlehead. Amulet deals 1 to each opponent, gets a counter, and Ryan exiles a Talisman of Dominance. Then Saw in Half resolves, Razorkin is destroyed, and Ryan creates 2 copies. Ryan taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Wheel of Fortune. He holds priority, cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. With Wheel still in the stack, Ryan escapes Orcish Bowmasters. It enters, pings Philip for 1, and Ryan amasses 1. Then Wheel resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 7. Razorkin Needlehead triggers 14 times for each opponent, and Orcish Bowmasters triggers 14 times, targeting Brandon. In response, Philip casts Veil of Summer. It resolves, and Philip draws. Both Razorkins trigger, and Philip takes 2. Then all of the triggers resolve, each opponent dies, and Ryan wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a fun set of games tonight. Congrats to Zeb and Ryan on their wins. In Game 1, for those of you who didn't notice, Zeb won on turn 3. Many say that this format has slowed down, and for the most part it has, but that doesn't mean that there is no explosiveness left in this game. Zeb was able to sequence his plays properly to close it out. If he had sequenced his triggers differently, Ryan would have received Nixilis triggers and could have possibly ended Zeb's loop. In Game 2, Ryan had a good start and had to fight through interaction. Once he was able to take out the stacks pieces and kill Zeb, he closed it out in style. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Opposition Agent. It wasn't seen on camera, but this card stopped a number of players from progressing their board states. Both Philip and Brandon were essentially dead in the water due to the tutors in their hands. Once it was removed, the game ended fairly quickly. A big thanks again to our patrons for playing in tonight's game. If you want to play in a game, join us on Patreon. You'll get all kinds of benefits. Links are in the description below. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time and we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.